Welcome back. We get into our panel discussion tonight where we unpack the week's top stories. There was explosive testimony by witness F and Brigadier Matjeng, who told the Madlanga Commission about her apparent affair with the alleged criminal kingpin Vusimuzi Cat Matlala. To help us unpack these and other top stories, we're joined by political analyst Professor Sethulego Matebesi, a Reputation First Group Managing Director, that's Tshepo Matseba, as well as a governance analyst, Hlumelo Xaba. Gentlemen, good to have you all on the program this evening. Professor Matebesi, I'll start with you. When you take a step back and look at the happenings at the Madlanga Commission, we've also now found out about another whistleblower death and all these scandals happening at once. What does it say, especially about the state of our democracy right now?
Good evening, Nhlanhla, and good evening to my fellow panelists, South Africans. Yeah, it's a sad week once again for South Africa, but not only for South Africa, but also for Africa, because South Africa has been a beacon of hope in terms of upholding the principles of democracy, but a kind of democracy that we are getting exposed to, especially with the high level of criminality. And here we don't speak about the man or the woman in the street. We're talking about senior police officials. We're talking about senior public servants that seems to be one way or the other involved in these criminal activities. And that does not bode well for us as a constitutional democratic country. And I just want to ask the question, where are the political leaders who are supposed to play oversight and accountability on the issues of justice and criminality in this country?
Hlumelo, from a governance perspective, do the attempted hits and deaths linked to the commission suggest a system that is still in control, or one that's been overtaken by criminals, really?
Good evening to you, Nhlanhla, and to the viewers, and to my fellow panelists. Thank you very much for having me. Well, I think that in my view, I have been very concerned in regards to the conduct of witnesses, both at the Madlanga Commission as well as the ad hoc inquiry. But to answer your question, I think if you can look at the sequence of events insofar as witnesses being eliminated and even those that have even committed suicide, because you remember that this precedent was set by the late former Minister of Police, Natim Tetwa, where it was alleged that he jumped over a high-story building in France, and then it was followed by the death of witness D at the Madlanga Commission, and now this Viandre Pretorius, who actually who's alleged to have shot himself last night. So I think that if you can look at the commonality between these witnesses, you will realize that it's those that have been implicated on the wrong side of the Madlanga Commission, because one thing that I always say is that the Madlanga Commission and the ad hoc inquiry have now created a picture, or rather they've sort of like created a scenario whereby they are saints and they are sinners, and it's up to us as the public to believe who falls on which side of the fence between these two categories. So I think now what becomes more apparent in these events whereby a witness commits suicide or gets eliminated is to actually give more credence to some of the allegations that have been leveled against some of these rogue elements, because Pretorius is alleged to have been involved in a murder and a torture case whereby they murdered alleged to have murdered someone in 2022. So all of these things now give credence to some of the testimony that has been given by someone like General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi as well as General Fani Masemula, and they even also give us as the public to have more confidence in what General Mkhwanazi has said. So I just think that it just, more than anything, everything that has been happening insofar as the elimination of witnesses is concerned just gives more credence to what General Mkhwanazi has said, and it also just bolsters the belief that there is indeed some rogue elements within the criminal justice system.
Mr. Matseba, from a reputational perspective, when the public sees whistleblowers dying and allegations piling up, what happens to the credibility of the state as a brand, especially in the eyes of ordinary South Africans?
Yeah, good evening. The issue is really not the question of the commissions themselves, because Commissions are a reparation or repair mechanism. But what we're dealing here now is whether there will be implementation and credibility of implementation of the recommendations and the findings of the Commission, and the extent to which that moves with speed, transparency, and consequence management. And what we find is that even though there are glaring issues that we can see at the Commission on a day-to-day basis, where you get a sense that people actually should be in jail or at least charged, and they can follow the justice system. So for public trust to be maintained in the institutions of the country, you really, really desperately need the speed of prosecution so that these individuals can be placed in front of the court and the justice system takes its course. The fact that you still have in the list that the president has issued, or the presidency, you still have about 4 people who have not actually been charged, means that the level of action is low and poor. And as a result, it dampens the whole process, because as a repair mechanism, what is required is no longer transparency, but speed of execution by the other parts of the justice system, so that this can be seen to work and trust can be regained. I think South Africans are fatigued of commissions. We've been through this before, but the level of speed at which matters are concluded and people are sent in overalls is very, very slow, especially when you reflect on what happened at Transnet and the fact that in the Zondo Commission, we're still dealing with those cases today. So that's the speed is actually a necessity.
Professor Matebesi, we do know that President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for better protection of whistleblowers especially. Politically speaking, is this leadership taking responsibility, or is it just reacting too late?
Yeah, very difficult question to respond to, because I can respond that in twofold. I mean, if you're close to the president or an ardent supporter, you will say it's very commendable that this commission is there because of a decision that has been taken by the president. But clearly, there are certain decisions that should have been taken somewhere else and not at this particular commission. But what is very commendable, I've got my own views and I share what my previous panelists have stated. I also don't believe in these commissions for one reason, that it seems as if when we have to take this decisive action, our leaders, then they almost like shift that particular responsibility. And I think the only joy that we as South Africans are getting out of this and this current commission as well is that at least we get a bit of a glimpse of what is happening with our taxpayers' money. But the sad thing about this, people are losing their lives. And I think there's a responsibility upon our leaders to act more decisively so that there should be consequent management. And the question is, going forward, that will be very interesting to see how do we deal with political leaders, those who are closely connected or have certain key positions within political parties, because thus far it seems as if action are now only being taken against police officials, and we still want to see that politicians are also being arraigned in those that have been mentioned at these commissions.
Hlumelo, in the same breath, commissions of inquiry are meant to strengthen accountability, but also they also meant to protect the truth. But are they actually putting people or people's lives in danger instead here?
Well, I think the nature of commissions of this nature, well, commissions generally, is that they do comprise of 2 components. Firstly, those that are actually going to bear witness and give testimony of the wrongdoing and the decay that is happening at the institutions that are under or the subject of the investigation. And then you do get those that are actually going to be the perpetrators. So historically in South Africa, what we've witnessed is that commissions have not really yielded any positive outcomes. For instance, we can go as far back as the TRC in the wake of our new democracy. till this day, there are still cases that have not yet been finalized in the TRC, to a point where, for instance, cases such as the death of Steve Biko there has now been an inquest into the death of Steve Biko, which actually corroborates the fact that some of these commissions don't really yield positive outcomes that actually lead to a finalization of a particular case. And then fast forward to the Marikana Commission as well as the Zondo Commission, which till now have not really yielded any tangible outcomes whereby those who are perpetrators can be held accountable. Instead, what we see is those that are giving testimony, like I alluded to just a while ago, who are usually whistleblowers, losing their lives and also placing their lives under risk because of the fact that they are speaking out against wrongdoing. So I think that I agree with my other panelists who actually alluded to the fact that as South Africans, we are very fatigued by commissions because this process as well is likely to drag. Remember, even and we must also take into account the fact that the preliminary report, which was issued out late last year, has not been divulged to the public. So I think that's another thing that is going to cause strain between the public and the executive, in particular the president, in regards to the length that commissions take. I agree with Prof. Matebesi as well that we see a lot of people being held accountable, yet politicians are always protected. In this instance, it was the one question that has been asked was, why has Minister Senzo Mchunu not been held accountable? Whereas he is at the center of this whole thing that is happening. He is because at the center of all of this is the disbandment of the political killings task team. Yet he has not been placed under any suspension or has not been dismissed. He still earns a salary, which is given to him by taxpayers' money, which actually goes to show that the accountability ecosystem within the higher echelons of our country's government is not as clear and optimal as we would want it to be as the public, because the people that have been mentioned, I believe, in the preliminary report, or those that have been held accountable, are small fish compared to the people that really need to be held accountable, which in my view are politicians. So I think a lot of work still needs to be done. Hopefully President Ramaphosa, given that one thing that I always said is that given that his term as his presidency has been marred by a lot of failures and shortcomings, will actually use this commission to redeem himself in ensuring that he leaves a legacy, which of course will translate to him actually cleaning out and bringing reform within the criminal justice system, and also bringing institutional credibility within this sector of our country.
Well, gentlemen, let's take a quick sip of water. We continue our discussion in a short while, unpacking the week's leading news stories, including all the happenings at the Madlanga Commission. Do stay with us. Well, we continue our discussion unpacking the week's leading stories, including John Steenhuisen also announcing that he'll be stepping down as a DA leader, but also looking at happenings at the Madlanga Commission this week. Let's continue with our guest, Tshepo Matseba, who's Reputation First Group Managing Director. Tshepo, we've already started speaking about issues calling for more accountability around the Madlanga Commission, but how damaging is it when the government talks transparency, but people don't feel safe or even protected?
Yeah, I mean, it's a serious risk, isn't it? Because the minute you create an impression that we are in a dangerous state where witnesses may be killed without consequences, you almost create a trend where witnesses may actually fear to participate and withdraw from participating, and that will obviously dampen all the efforts that this commission is trying to achieve. What matters, I think, in this specific commission is that you can actually, let's say theoretically, observing the interviews and the conversations there, you can actually get a sense that there will be consequences. You also get a sense that the commissioners have the right intent to get the truth out, and that there will be some type of action. The opportunity that one of our colleagues mentioned earlier about President Ramaphosa having to leave actually a good legacy from a governance perspective is a big one, and it's one that I believe that he shouldn't actually take for granted. And right now, where we are at, the risk in terms of, I guess the pressing need is for the security cluster, for the South African police, for the NPA to tell us how they're going to protect the witnesses, so that the promise of the work that's being done doesn't get diluted by the fact that there are fears of testifying. And you actually end up as well with an opportunity where senior people who've already said, but I feel threatened, I feel like my life is under threat. Actually, it seems like they are coming out more often with the truth than not. And so the space here is for the senior leaders in the instruments of governance, especially the NPA, the South African police, to tell us how actually, and make that promise and fulfill it, how they are going to protect every single witness, whether that witness is for the state or not for the state. And everyone needs to protect it. We can't live in an environment where we are now really being driven by cartels to a point where democracy is silenced at this level.
Professor Matebesi, let's wrap up at least this theme, but also looking back, have commissions in South Africa really delivered justice or mostly just delayed it?
Can you just repeat your question?
I'll repeat it, Prof. I'm saying, looking back, have commissions really delivered justice or mostly just delayed it?
Yeah, well, it's to a certain extent, I think we've covered this to indicate that, look, commissions has perhaps an unintended consequence. And one of the consequences, these unintended consequences, is that at least we are now privy to things that, oh, I don't know what would have happened if this particular trajectory have continued unabated. But for me, what is really worrisome is that even with all the revelations at these commissions, the current Madlanga Commission, the killings continue, and that for me, it's really a worry. But definitely, commissions has a role to play, but we still need a template, a historical template that will dictate to us that at least the recommendations coming out of these commissions are implemented.
Hlumelo, let's turn to party politics. I mentioned the name of John Steenhuisen a bit earlier. How should we, or rather South Africans, then interpret John Steenhuisen's exit from the DA leadership amid this internal tensions that we're reading about, but also a lot of public scrutiny around the DA?
I think, firstly, I'll start off by saying that what is currently unfolding in the DA is testament to the fact that all political parties, and I mean all, are susceptible to internal instability that is usually underscored by a contestation for power, because these are things that we usually see in a party like the ANC, whereby you see warring factions actually going at each other and the powerful faction actually dominating by pushing others out, or by actually ensuring that they don't get access to the levers of power within the party, which ultimately leads to them actually getting access to the levers of power in parties are susceptible to internal instability, which is underscored by a contestation for power. But moving to John Steenhuisen's withdrawal from the late last year, following Dion, or rather before Dion George had actually, or just I think it was after Dion George actually announced his resignation from the party. John Steenhuisen did allude to the fact that he will be seeking a third term, and that was not so long ago. But what changed my concern is what changed between then and said a while ago, following Dion George's resignation, or rather resignation from the party, was that John Steenhuisen's survival within the DA is going to depend on how those that are supporters of Dr. Dion George are going to react in the manner in how John Steenhuisen actually treated Dr. Dion George, because at the center of all of this is the fight between him and John Steenhuisen, which I believe now is actually culminated to what we see, whereby John Steenhuisen is actually withdrawing from the leadership race. But apart from that, I think one thing that we can also take into cognizance is how attentive the DA is to its stakeholders and to its constituency. By stakeholders, I'm referring to those that are external to the party and who actually fund the party, mainly comprising of the people within the big business sector, because we do know that the DA is actually more reliant on these actors in order for in how it functions. So I think that we saw this with Musima Imane, we even saw it with Herman Mashaba, whereby the DA's voter share declined in 2019, and what happened subsequently after that is that Musima Imane was ultimately pushed out of the party. So whenever the interest of some of these actors are under threat or are at risk of diminishing, they actually alert those who are internal within the party or who have more power within the party, people such as Helen Zille and Tony Leon, to deal with the situation before it gets out of hand to a point where they actually lose a certain support from a particular constituency, or maybe losing funding from those that are external actors. So I think that John Steenhuisen's withdrawal from the race was actually giving a reassurance to some of these constituencies and some of these stakeholders that everything is still intact, and to also try and ensure that there is unity within the party, because what Jordan Hill-Lewis, who seems to be a front runner now following John Steenhuisen's withdrawal, actually did allude to the fact that he'll never run against John Steenhuisen because they are friends and all of that. But what changed now is what I wanted to actually notice is how the tone has changed in Jordan Hill-Lewis's tone insofar as contesting for the top position within the DA. So all of these dynamics actually stem from how the DA is controlled by various constituencies and stakeholders, and how reactive they are in terms of being attentive to these people.
Thanks for that, Hlumelo. Let's unpack this a bit more, Mr. Matseba. Perceptions of behind-the-scenes power, even when denied. How quickly do these narratives erode trust in political leadership brands like the DA?
Yeah, I think there are certainly levers of power behind the scenes running matters within a political party such as the DA. And importantly, I think that there was a failed or missed opportunity, because if in messaging, because if Mr. Steenhuisen was not pushed out as he would like us to believe, and that he's going to invest in spending time on dealing with foot and mouth disease, he would actually could easily just, as he says, he's choosing to stay in cabinet. He could actually leave cabinet if there was a conflict of interest in that sense of spending time, whether you spend time in government or whether you spend time building the party. And if the interest, if they believe, and he believes that he would still add value in the party and that he was still relevant, actually from a leadership point of view, he could have chosen to stay with the party and help rebuild and strengthen the party that he claims to have helped grow over the past couple of years. But actually, on the contrary, he chooses what may seem like and I'm not saying this literally, but the fat cat principle of going towards spending time with the very comfortable cabinet roles and the benefits. He was facing very serious allegations of misuse of the party funds. And those allegations were made by a person who was responsible for, at some point, for the DA's treasury. And therefore, none of this can be taken and should be taken for granted. The problem in our country is that there is a narrative that has been painted and created that corruption is black, and that leadership instability is black, and perhaps in the ANC and other parties that are led predominantly by Africans and blacks. But in this specific instance, we have a leader who has actually poorly performed. Since he went into cabinet, he forgot about his party politics. But importantly, he didn't take his stakeholders, his community and constituencies into his confidence that he's actually taking the party. He seemed like an excessive collaborator who reminds me of how the party, the National Party, dwindled into oblivion after they merged or were swallowed within the constant context of the ANC. So the risk, I think, for the party, image-wise, is that it seemed like he was, when you listen to the narrative by Tony Leon, it seems like there's a suggestion that he was leaning, Mr. Steenhuisen was leaning more towards getting too closer to the ANC, and that's not comfortable for the funders, but also not comfortable for the majority of voters, perhaps, of this political party.
Professor Matebesi, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on these developments, but also to expand the conversation a bit more. We are unpacking the week's leading stories, and South Africa's name appearing in global stories like the Epstein files, it may be very limited, but politically, does perception matter more than fact?
Yes, most definitely. Remember, people and public trust sometimes depends on the perceptions of individuals. And in terms of even your so-called community protest, we have seen on numerous occasions how people will go to the street on the basis of perceptions, right or wrong. And the same happens when it comes to political trust, political ideologies that are out there. And I think the same will apply to a party like the Democratic Alliance, but also in general. Some of the news that have been peddled in the international media does create a negative narrative about the political landscape in a country that perhaps we've been led by people who still are under a political hallucination. We are led by politicians who perhaps does not know how to respond. But I just quickly want to go back also to this whole issue of the Democratic Alliance. I know you've moved on. For me, it's perhaps what is commendable in the instance of the Democratic Alliance. They may think that they've perhaps now dealt with this issue, but coming back to your question about political trust, I strongly believe the damage have already been done. It's going to be very difficult to deal with the cobwebs of this John Hazen's saga. And the same applies to the body politics in South Africa, where sometimes the inaction, the inability of our leaders to take decisive action has huge consequences for South Africans. And I strongly believe that actions like this, issues like this, has a huge impact, huge reputational damage for this particular country.
Hlumelo, ahead of SONA 2026, crime, unemployment, water shortages and governance failures, I mean, these are dominating public concern. What should the president prioritize to really restore confidence this time around? Okay, it seems Hlumelo has, well, we have dropped the line to Hlumelo, or do we have him back? Hlumelo, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Right. I was saying that SONA
2026
is coming up, and crime, unemployment, water shortages, and governance failures. These are dominating public concern currently. What would you say? What should the president be planning, especially to prioritize? What issues should he prioritize ahead of the SONA?
Well, I've been listening to some of the president's engagements over the past month or so, particularly his January 8th statement, because what I usually say is that the January 8th statement, in my view, always serves as a precursor to what we can expect the government to do, because the ANC, for the longest of times, has been the leading figure within our country's political landscapes. Therefore, when the January 8th statement is delivered, you would then get an idea of what we would expect in the SONA and also what the government is going to focus on. And what President Cyril Ramaphosa had alluded to was that they want to stimulate service delivery in local government. In essence, he was basically saying that they want to make local government work. But this is not the first time he's articulating something like this. You will recall that even last year, there was a white paper on local government, which ultimately got, whose process ultimately got concluded. And it's not the first time that he was saying that the government wants to make local government work. But the contradiction here is that if you can look at the amount of money that is allocated to local government, you will realize that it's far below what is expected for local government to function adequately, because only 9 or 10% of the budget gets allocated to local government. And that's where the concern is for me, because municipalities are said to actually be reliant more on the grants as well as collecting their own revenue. But then if you look at the size of some municipalities, you will realize that majority of the areas, I'll make an example with an municipality in the Eastern Cape, which is Enoch Mgijima, which is probably one of the most poorly performing municipalities, and also one municipality that is situated in a rural area, meaning that the majority of the people they are indigents and don't actually pay water and electricity rates. So that puts a lot of strain on municipalities, meaning that they cannot really just rely on the amount that they collect through rates and taxes, but they also need more stimulation and financial injection from National Treasury. So that's where that's the one aspect that I'm actually looking forward to hear what alternatives the president is bringing in ensuring that they actually stimulate the efficiency of the local government sphere.
Yeah. Tshepo, what are the consequences, really, if SONA once again raises expectations that are not met on the ground? What does this do, especially from a reputational standpoint?
Yeah, so the SONA right now is an opportunity, and the president has an opportunity to close the gap between announcements and actual delivery. So the speed of delivery in between the day on which he makes the statements needs to be closed. That gap needs to be closed. There are promises that he makes every year, and when you reflect towards the SONA, you realize that many promises were made, but very, very little happened in the middle, or we are actually moving towards further announcements, further summits, and further promises. I think that globally, the president makes sense in the sense that South Africa's foreign policy is consistent. How we talk about issues such as Gaza, we are very, very clear, and I think consistent as a peace, pro-peace and environment. But domestically, we have a problem of non-delivery. When you look at the water crisis, when you look at the energy issue is still pretty much alive. If you drive around Gauteng province, you'll notice the extent to which permanently certain traffic lights do not operate. But when we had G20, all of these things were very much functional. So trust is being eroded, if you ask me, if we are not willing and able to close that gap between the promise and delivery. And so the president would, as part of his legacy project, would need to drive all cabinet ministers and all instruments around him and use the state machinery to actually close that gap so that the promises that he makes can be fulfilled very quickly in this financial year that we're going into and while he's still in power.
Professor Matebesi, a difficult one, but you wearing the hat of the president this time around, if you could fix one thing right now to restore trust and stability, what would it be? What would it look like?
Most definitely it will be consequent management. We haven't seen that. And this is a long-standing political nightmare, elephant in the room, where when action needs to be taken about individuals. One thing that I don't understand is that If you look at public protectors' annual reports, whether it's now state entities, your national departments, and even at local government level, I just don't understand where in some reports or some statements you will hear some leaders even stating that it seems as if we've made significant progress, whereas billions of rand cannot be accounted. That, for me, is where the president needs to intervene and say, not in my name. I'm not going to allow this to happen going forward. I want to ensure the future of this country, the future generations, and I want to leave a legacy of consequence management. And one way to do that is that action needs to be taken against financial officers. Action needs to be taken against HODs, and this whole thing of moving people from one unit to the other to try and so in a political parlance to scratch their back should come to an end. But so for me, a starting point is definitely consequent management in terms of those who are embezzling state funds.
Hlumelo, as we conclude, with pressure on policing, services and infrastructure, are we reaching a breaking point as a country at this point?
Well, to be honest with you, what seems to be evident in my view is that the war that is happening within the South African Police Service has actually permeated into other sectors of our society, in that you can detect this from the testimonies that are given at the Madlanga Commission and the ad hoc inquiry. So I think that our policing system, like just to answer your question, has reached a point now where it has actually lost a lot of public credibility, and there's a lot of public distrust between those that are in authority and the general public. And I think that the Madlanga Commission becomes very important in this aspect, in ensuring that we do actually act, the president and even those that are in authority.
It seems we have lost Hlumelo there, but maybe let me turn that question also to you as well, Mr. Matebesi. What happened with pressure really, as we are seeing, on policing, services, infrastructure issues as well? Are we reaching a breaking point as a country?
No, I don't think we've reached a breaking point yet, but it's extremely worrying. I think if I was the president, if I was sitting in a leadership position, even in the opposition, but I would be worried, because what is currently happening in this country is not good. People are afraid, yes, even those with credible evidence, perhaps, going forward. I don't think anybody would want to expose them to some of these commissions because of the consequences there. And I don't think also our democracy should become a weapon where people have to lose their lives. So from my side, I strongly believe that, yes, what we still have, we can still consolidate, but we are along a very dangerous trajectory, actually what I would call slippery slopes, and it will all depend on how do we arrest this decline, because it's not good for South Africa going forward.
Let me thank you all for your time. Professor Sethulego Matebesi, Tshepo, Matseba, as well as Hlumelo Xaba, giving us their insights tonight. Of course, tonight's weekly wrap began with the hard question about the state of our democracy, and it ends with an even harder truth, that South Africa is not short of commissions or statements or even promises. It is short of consequences, protection and trust as well in our governance systems.